tonight. So I'm the designated sub. Of course, Mike's, I think, in Kentucky, working for mission support. Ben is at camp, and who else? Not sure where Mike, the other Mike is. And then Will's in Zimbabwe. So I'm fourth-string quarterback, so we'll do our best we can in that. Okay. All right. Before we get started, I'd ask Brother Mike if he would lead us in opening prayer.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and for every day that you continue to provide for each of us. And we thank you for the time that we have to come together to open up our Bibles, to study from the holy and divine word. And Father, at this time we pray that you be with Scott, bless him as he directs our thoughts and our lesson. We also pray for those that are sick, that have lost loved ones. We pray that you be with the doctors that would administer unto them. And Father, for those that are sorrowful at this time, we pray that you would comfort them as well. Father, we continue to pray for our country. We pray that you would be with our leaders. We also pray for our leadership here, be with our elders, and continue to bless them. And as we depart tonight, we pray that you would keep us safe. As our prayer in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, sir. All right, when Mike asked me to fill in for him tonight, he only had two drill instructions. He said, one, use the book, start on page 70, and number two, try to close this thing out and put a bow on it tonight. So we're going to do the best we can to make both of those things happen. So we're beginning there on page 70, the burden of the strong, and we'll be in chapter 14 of Romans. And the first little section there will go all through 14 and through the first, I think, about 6 verses of chapter 15. Romans, and we read in there, which we know it was a book written by Paul to the church at Rome. He hadn't been there at that time, but he had written a letter to them addressing some of the issues they were having. And it's pretty clear there that there was some strife between the ones there who were raised Jewish and those who were Gentiles. So there was a little bit of an issue. Even though they were all Christians, they still had some isms there about where they had been before they came together to be Christians. And I think that's not a problem that went away in the first century church. We still have that today, where we have people from different backgrounds that come together, and we have to drop those things, I think, at the door and become Christians when we're together. And we're going to talk about some of those problems they were having at that time and still some of the issues that we have somewhat today. We all know and read about, especially in Galatians, where it talked about Judaizing teachers, where there was a group of converts when the church first began who were raised strictly Jewish, and they were still holding on to some of their old ways, their Jewish ways, to the point that they were teaching that Gentiles who came in had to first basically convert to Judaism and then to Christianity, and had to do a lot of things under the old law before they could be acceptable as Christians, and that was incorrect. That was some of the issues they were having here, I believe. But it says here in the book, it says some of this had to do with issues of the law, circumcision, and morality, but precise details of those differences between them or which matters they disputed are not given until we get here to chapter 14. In 14, we're going to talks about three things where they were having an issue with: eating meats, observing certain days, and then also the drinking of wine. So we'll touch on some of those tonight, and this is not an attempt to dive deep into those because you could get on a whole study about each one of those, but we will try to mention those tonight. But here he talks about verses 1 through 3, in the version he has here. Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to disputes over doubtful things. For one believes he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat. Let him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. Some people jokingly use this little passage here to preach against being a vegetarian. It says he is weak who eats only vegetables. Okay, I fall into that category. I don't feel like I've had a meal if I hadn't had some kind of meat in it. Just a little bit of something. But I heard a joke one time said, vegetarian is an old Cherokee word that translates means bad hunter, so not able to kill anything meat to eat. But they were having an issue here about whether eating meat, not eating meat. Now this issue had been also raised in Corinthians, there in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. But there, the issue they were talking about was not whether to eat meat, but it was talking about eating meat that had been offered to idols. And their issue there was, well, if that meat has been offered to idols as part of their pagan sacrifice, and I eat it, then I'm partaking in that pagan worship. And that was the issue they're having here. And that's not the issue here, best of my understanding. Here's not the offered meat. It says it seems far more likely that the Romans were contending over Mosaic food laws. In the law, only certain meats prepared in certain ways could be eaten by a devout Jew. Unclean foods would defile the eater, making him a sinner, unable to worship God, and in need of purification. If you need to review that, if you go back and read Leviticus chapter 11, the whole chapter 1 through 47 there talks about all the Jewish food laws and what they were to eat and not to eat. You know, cloven hoof, chews the cud. If it swam, then it had to have fins and scales. So no catfish. I'm glad we're not under that today. I like catfish. You know, but they were very strict about what God had laid down for them to eat, and they had been observing that for centuries. And when they came under the new law, where that was not a deal, some of them really struggled with that, and we'll talk about that a little bit tonight. You know, one example we have of that is what book is it in? I forgot now, but it's where Peter goes to Cornelius, and he sees a vision where lets down a sheet, and it's got all these unclean animals in it. And, you know, when the voice comes from heaven and says, kill and eat, he says, no, I've never ate anything unclean. And he repeats that message like 3 or 4 times. And he doesn't know what that means. And then these men come from Cornelius that he has saw a vision and sent his men to him for Peter to come to him. And then he understands that God's talking about now the Gentiles are not unclean. They're just like you. We're all just people. Everybody can become Christians. So in that way, you know, we see that issue there where that was a dilemma. Also, we read about, of course, Daniel when him and his fellows there with him were taken captive and taken into Babylonia. They were chosen to be trained to be servants of the king while they were in captivity. And part of that was they were to eat certain types of food, and he said, we can't eat that. That's not in our laws. We can't do that. And of course they agreed to, you know, give us a trial period here. Let us just eat vegetables. And they did it, and they were fine. So, you know, and I joke about that. I teach anatomy at Mars Hill and anatomy and physiology, and one of the last parts we do is about the digestive system and nutrition. And we talk about, you know, you can get everything you need from eating plants if you do it right. You have to plan out your menu right, or you will be lacking on some things. But there's some athletes now. I think there's a guy, Justin Fields, played quarterback for Ohio State and then for the Bears for 2 or 3 years. But he went vegetarian early on, and you see him, and it didn't hurt him. I mean, he's bigger, stronger. Says feels better than he ever has. So as far as eating meat, not eating meat, that's beside the point. But those are some background issues that we hear from. But here, see in the last paragraph on page 71, their continued adherence to the law did not stop with food. Okay, there was also dispute over the observance of special days. And Paul says that some esteem one day above another esteems every day alike. So in verse 5 here's where he's talking about that. And probably what they're talking about here is particularly the Sabbath day, which the Jews had, again, that's been part of their culture, their religion. And that's the thing. And I think sometimes as Americans, I hate to say this, but I believe it's true, that we kind of separate our religion from our everyday life. We shouldn't. But a lot of people in their religion, especially the Jews, it was 24/7. I mean, it was their culture. It was how they did everything, how they ate, when they worked, everything, which is how it should be for us with Christianity. But again, I'm afraid to say that's not always the case, I don't think. But for them it was. So to stop doing that when they became Christians was hard. You know, that'd been ingrained in them for a long time. And you see people today maybe who convert to Christianity from another religion today, is they still have some of those things that they've always been taught that it's kind of hard for them to let go of. And I think we have to be patient with them, and we're going to talk about that here in a few minutes. But that was another issue they were having, was whether to observe these days, was that right or wrong? And then the last one here talks about on top of page 72, says the final question, probably related to others in verse 21, is good neither to eat meat nor drink wine nor do anything by which your brother stumbles or is offended or is made weak. The question of drinking wine here may simply be an extension of the Old Testament food laws. Though Israel was allowed to drink wine, some wine would defile and cause the drinker to sin. Daniel said that to drink the king's wine would have defiled him. Also possible here in Romans 14, though, that the question is whether a Christian can or should drink any wine, that is, any alcoholic beverage at all. Some may have been insisting in their right to do so, while others advocated total abstinence. Teetotaler, we call it today, they didn't drink at all. So those are three things that they were disputing over. In the church, in the congregation there, was whether you could eat meat, whether you should observe or not observe certain holidays, and the drinking of wine. Okay? So if you were looking, like it says here, for a clear and definitive answer on these moral and doctrinal questions, Paul's answers here may be very disappointing because he doesn't pick a side. Okay? It says he refuses to be drawn in the quarrel between the parties. Rather, his approach was to tell them that being right on these matters was not nearly as important as being considerate or loving to one's brother in Christ. So these things, he's telling them, it's not a make or break getting you to heaven. The deal is here is how are you treating your brother? Are you loving your brother? Are you trying to impose something you believe on him that's not essential to salvation? Those are some things that he was dealing with, and I'll throw about some issues I've been involved with that here in a few minutes. But to solve the dispute, Paul established several primary principles. All right, number one, first, to whom the Christian is accountable. We're not accountable to other Christians. We're accountable to God. And that's the key he makes to him. You're not accountable. The Jews are the Gentiles, but Gentiles, especially here, I don't think the Gentiles are the Jews. You Gentiles don't have to answer to the Jews about being a Jew before you can be a Christian. That's not correct. Okay? Humans are not authorized to stand as judges on those of other matters. This particularly applies to those areas where God has given liberty, there in verse 5 and 6. That is, eating meat will not save your soul, nor will eating only vegetables. Okay? That's not part of the plan of salvation. So whether you choose to eat meat or whether you choose to eat vegetables, that's neither here nor there when it comes to getting to heaven. All right? God has not commanded you eating or abstinence. And we read that in 1 Timothy chapter 4, 3 through 5. So where God has not judged, man must not. I think we have to be careful about that. Where God has not set a judgment, we sure can't judge, and we can't judge anyway, but surely if God doesn't have a say in on that, we can't impose our judgment on that. So I think we have to be careful about that. And when it comes to customs, there's a lot of customs that are, we can be Christians and you go someplace else and you see these people and the way they live and the way we live is completely different. It's not good or bad either one, it's just how you were raised. I know I was reading about some of these today, just refresh your memory on some of these, but like in some countries, if you give thumbs up, that's the same thing as holding up the middle finger. That's very offensive to them. Some places, if you show the soles of your feet, like if I were to sit back, kick up, put my feet up, and lean back in a chair, that's very offensive. Okay, one of my daughters has some friends that are Asian, and she said when you go to their house, it's offensive if you don't take your shoes off when you walk in. You know, you don't wear your shoes in the house. That's a big offense to them in their house. So there's certain things there that in some cultures is offensive that we would not consider. So those things are not make or break for being a Christian. We tolerate those within each other, what your differences are, where you were raised, or whatever. So second, it says Christians must live in full awareness of their relationship both to God and to fellow Christians. And he says here in through verse 10, for none of us lives to himself, no one dies to himself. For if we live, we live to the Lord. If we die, we die to the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. Or do we not show contempt for our brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Okay. Another example of this I thought of just now as I was reading that, but a friend of mine who used to know at Winfield, he had worked at the University of South Alabama, Mobile, for a while, and I forget exactly what his title was, but anyway, he dealt with the international students. And he said some of the American students come to him and said, can you talk to some of these international students? Said, they smell. Said, they don't bathe like we do and use deodorant. Said, we're offended by that. And he said, okay, I will. He said, but let me tell you something. Yesterday, they came to me and was telling the same thing about y'all. He said Americans wear so much perfume and aftershave and all this stuff that they can't hardly, it just knocks them down to walk by you. So it depends on where you're from, on what's acceptable and what you find weird and what's not weird. So, as Christians, that's what he's telling them. Don't get caught up in those things. Be understanding of each other's differences when it comes to just being different. Answer to what God has told us to do, and that's the standard. Okay. It says, some in Rome apparently boasted their greater knowledge and spiritual maturity. To them Paul commanded, receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to dispute over doubtful things. If some were indeed stronger than others, then they have a greater responsibility to bear the burdens of the weak so as not to cause them to stumble. As in all things Christian, getting one's own way to the detriment of others is sin. Philippians 2, 3 through 4. So there he talks about the fact that when you're willful, and it's my way or the highway, why do we have so many different churches? I mean, all claim to be Christian. Why are all these different? Where did they start to split? It was when people had different opinions and they couldn't work them out. They said, well, I'll just go over here with our own group and we'll do our own thing. We believe this is how it should be, so we'll go over here. Well, we'll go over here and we'll call our own group and we'll do this. But that's not what God set it out to be. I heard a story one time of a missionary, and they went to this place where they were the first members of the church to come there and preach to these people. And the natives were very willing to listen to what they had to say. But after they listened, they said, well, we're confused. They said, what do you mean? They said, well, there's another group that came through here a few months ago. They said they were Christians, and they're not telling us the same thing that you are. So how confusing would that be if you'd never heard anything about Christ, and you have two different people come in and say they're a Christian, but they're telling you two different things. And that's what we're told, you speak the same thing so that they will know that you're from me. So it is confusing to people who don't know when we do that. So that unity is a big deal, okay? So if we are stronger than others, then we should be the ones who are more willing and accepting, not more hard-headed when it comes to some of these things, okay? Third principle it says, which Paul imposes, that of conscience. Okay, dangerous ground. We see you can't let conscience be your guide. But in some ways it has to be. Okay, but your conscience has to be trained. That's the thing. Okay, if your conscience has not been trained right, then you can't listen to your conscience. All right, there are kids who are raised in a tough situation where they're taught it's okay to steal. Okay, it's okay. Steal from the man. Okay, we need it to survive. They got plenty. All right, that's okay. You got to combat that. That's how they were raised, even though that's not right. That's still how it is sometimes. Okay, so if your conscience has been correctly taught and trained, then yes. But the problem here comes is when you do things that you think are wrong. You can think something is right and not be right, but if you think something is wrong and you do it, you are wrong. And that's the point he's making here. He says, let each be fully convinced in his own mind. But if he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because he does not eat from faith, for whatever is not from faith is sin. Conscience is not always an infallible guide to our conduct. There may be sins which do not trouble one's conscience, because that particular person has never been taught they are sin. If he does them, he is still in the wrong, even though ignorant. And I'll give you an example of that, I guess. My dad was raised Baptist. What little he went to church when he was growing up, I can remember when my dad was baptized. I was big enough to remember that. But he was when he was converted, he was hardline conservative. And anything that came up that was any inkling of looking like what he had saw in the Baptist church, he was against it. When I was a teenager, they started a group in the Marion County down there where a lot of the young people, there were probably 50 of them, got together and they started a chorus, a singing group. And they didn't sing, it was not a choir, it was a chorus. And they sang, and they would entertain at other things, not during church service. But my dad said, you're not going to be a part of that, because that's how the choir got started. Okay, whether that's true or not, but to him, that would violate his conscience if he allowed me to do that because he believed it was wrong. Whether it was wrong or not, he could not, in good conscience, allow his children to take part in that. So I didn't because he's daddy. So I did what he said. Okay, so that was an example maybe from my life that I think maybe kind of fits into this, what they're talking about. All right? Like it says, there may be sins that don't trouble their conscience, but if those things are wrong, they're still wrong. Okay? But if you're doing something that you think is wrong, to you it is wrong until you learn better. Okay? So that he says this is the case with some of the Jews who had been taught all their life not to eat pork or work on the Sabbath. So to them, if they were not still keeping that and they believed that they were in the wrong, then they were wrong. All right. So why is it wrong then to violate one's conscience? Page 74, it says Paul's answer is it's not from faith. So one violating his own understanding of right and wrong. If I'm willing to do what is wrong, what I believe is wrong, I'll voluntarily violate God's law when I clearly understand it correctly if I want to. That's a rebellious spirit, and that's what's unacceptable to God. So having a rebellious spirit is the worst thing that we can do. Where I'm going to do what I want to do, whether God says it's right or not. In my mind, it's right, so I'm going to do it. That is wrong. All right, so it says then Paul's fourth principle underlies the whole chapter. Nothing is as important as the soul. If eating meat may set an example which causes a weak brother to sin and jeopardize his salvation, then we shouldn't eat meat. It's just not that important, okay? It's just not that important for me to do what I want to do if it's going to cause somebody else to stumble. I'll give you an example of that. My daughter Jordan, a few months ago, I guess 6 months ago now, she's diagnosed. We went for a regular checkup, and they said, wow, your blood sugar is 440. And so checked her and said, yeah, you're type 1 diabetic. So, or whatever the lowest one is. I always get those two confused. But so changed her diet, put her on medicine, all this kind of stuff. So she's been really great. She sticks to it. She is religious, as they say about it. If she don't think she's supposed to eat it, she doesn't eat it. So I'm around her all the time, so I don't eat it either. Okay, and it really kills me. So she can't have a chocolate chip cookie in the house, and I don't bring chocolate chip cookie in the house because that would cause her to stumble. So I think this is kind of similar to what he's talking about here. All right. I try to support her in what she's doing. I don't want her to stumble because it is wrong for her to eat it, not wrong for me to eat it. I'm not diabetic. I can eat chocolate chip cookies, whole pack of soft batch, heat it in the microwave and milk. That's a great way to go to sleep. But I don't do that because she can't handle it. That's not to say if she's not around, I might not switch. I might not eat chocolate chip cookies. Okay, but when around her, I try not to do that. Okay, so what he's saying here, the soul is what's most important. If what you're doing is offending somebody and causing them to stumble, then it's wrong for you to do it. Whether it's wrong for you to do it or not, if it's making them fail, then you should not do that. And that goes back to where we were there a while ago. What was that verse? Philippians, where you are esteeming others more than yourself. So I make you more important than me. So if it's something you need, I'm going to do it for you. I'm going to put myself second. So that's how we're to be as Christians. 15:1-2 says, we then who are strong ought to bear with the scruples of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, leading to edification. So Paul concluded that discussion with be like-minded toward one another according to Christ Jesus. You may with one mind and one mouth glorify the Lord our Father and our Lord Jesus Christ. So again, he says, with regards to the eating of meat or observance of day, the Bible hadn't commanded yes or no on those things. It's a matter of individual choice. As long as those principles are honored and followed and you don't cause somebody else to stumble, then that's up to you. All right? We call it matters of expediency. It says Christians are to study each question and do what's best for the church as a whole in every case. Next one. Paul did not give specific instructions here about the issue of wine. The Bible is not silent on the matter, and some things may be deducted from general discussion. So all the things he talked about, they didn't talk about everything in Romans, but the things they did talk about, he went into big detail. Drinking wine is not one of them, and that's an issue that's still around today, and that's an issue in the church. There's people who don't have a problem with it, and there are people who have a big problem with it. Okay, I was on a trip, work trip, back, it's been 4 or 5 years ago, I guess now, with two fellow school administrators all three of us remember the church. One of us was as conservative as you can get. Another one was a little bit more on the liberal side. And they got into a big discussion in the car going down the interstate about social drinking. And it was a long ride. And they got heated, and I was trying to be the mediator and keep one of them from throwing the other one out the car, So we're trying to stress this thing right here, what we're talking about tonight, okay? About what the Bible says about it. And you may have strong feelings about it. I have of my own, but I've tried to be open-minded enough to keep studying this subject over and over and over to try to see if there's anything I've missed and where do I stand on it for myself. Because like I said, if I think it's wrong and I do it, then it's wrong. All right. So Solomon in Proverbs issues strong warnings against wine, not only when taken to excess, but in any use. Proverbs 21 states, wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler. In 23, 29, 35, the miserable end of the drunkard is described. But note that verse 31, the warning is the temptation of the first drink. It's commanded not to even look at wine in the cup to be tempted by it. And I think that part kind of goes back to the Garden of Eden. We talk about the first sin. He told them not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He told them don't even touch it. Okay, that was his warning. Stay away from it. And I think a lot of us today, we try to see how close can I get to sin without sinning. Okay, if I'm driving down the road and I'm meeting a semi and he's hugging the middle line, I'm not going to hug the middle line. I'm going to get off to the side. I'm not going to see how close I can get and make our mirrors touch as we go by. I'm going to try to stay away from that. Okay, that's self-preservation. Same thing with sin. We should try to stay away from it. I heard a football coach had this discussion with his team the first meeting of the year. He had them in a little slanting down mini auditorium type class, and he had a box up there, and he was talking about right and wrong and staying away from temptation, these kind of things. And he reached in a box and he pulled out a snake and he just threw it up in the crowd. And of course they all scattered, running over, knocking each other down, trying to get away, And the snake wasn't poisonous, but I've done the same thing. Any snake's scary to me. So, he told me, he said, you see how you ran from that? If you're in a room and somebody comes in with drugs or alcohol, you should run just like that, just like you did from that snake, because it's just as dangerous. So he made a point, and to me that's the point that they're kind of making here. The Proverbs makes is that wine, strong drink, is dangerous. Stay away from it, okay? Man's mother instructed her son, it's not for kings, O man, it's not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes intoxicating drink, lest they drink and forget the law, pervert the justice of all afflicted. So the condemnation of strong drinks, she suggests, is the appropriate drink of those who are already lost and miserable. The implication is they're not already beyond hope. Their drinking would soon ensure it. So Paul states it is good not to drink wine. His reason was that by doing so, one's brother might be made to stumble. Again, like we said, Paul doesn't take a stance on this and tell them whether to drink or not to drink. He just talks about whether or not you're going to cause your brother to stumble by doing it. He said it's difficult to imagine a situation in which intoxicating drink can be used without tempting someone to sin. If the drinker is alone, you're tempting yourself toward drunkenness. If he's with others, his influence may lead to their drunkenness. If they believe that any drinking of alcohol is sin, they will be tempted to violate their conscience, thus causing them to sin. Okay. He says on top of page 76, even if the act of taking a small amount of alcoholic beverage were not sinful in and of itself, the burden of not presenting an obstacle to others would necessitate abstinence on the part of every loving Christian. Paul said we should not drink wine. One should also recognize the Greek word often translated wine can, and sometimes does, include fresh, unfermented grape juice. The debate in Rome may involve all used to drink whether or not it was fermented. So the Bible, where it uses that, when you start translating those words, whether the word there for wine, whether that means intoxicating or just grape juice, some of those words are used the same word in different situations. So it's very hard to go through and pick that. This is personal opinion. You didn't ask for it, but I'll give this part. We had a youth minister one time who told the kids, and I was elder sitting in with him in his classes. He said, I wish I could tell y'all, I could find you the verse in the Bible that says, thou shalt not drink alcohol. He said, I've looked. He said, my dad was an alcoholic. I wish it was in there. He said, but I can't find it. He said, but there's principles in there that warns against it and what it can do to you. He says, and that's all that I can tell you about that. I was raised in a household where nobody drank. Okay, And I grew up in a dry county where you didn't see it. And when they first introduced it, and I was, 35, 40 years old, and I'd go in a grocery store or Walmart and I'd see that in the store, it still kind of freaked me out. It's like, what's that doing in here? It was just, I was not around it, so that was not an issue for me. Now, some people can say they've never drank their whole life, never touched a drop. I wish I could say that, but I can't. I was young and stupid at sometimes and did some things I shouldn't have done and learned by my mistakes, but that was one of them I didn't develop a problem for, thank goodness. But some people take the argument of, well, if it takes 4 drinks to get you drunk and you take 1 drink, then you're 1/4 drunk. I don't know. I don't know whether that's taking it to extremes. I don't know about that. Like I said, these are some things you have to decide for yourself if it's right or wrong for you. Okay. I know my girls one time we went to Gatlinburg to the mountains, and we were riding around getting to the hotel, and one of mine little, she had to go to use the bathroom. So she said, I got to go right now. So okay, so we pulled in this parking lot to a restaurant. They weren't open yet, but her and my wife went in, and she came back out, and she was maybe 6 years old, and she was stomping mad. And when he said, what is it? She said, she didn't want to go in there and use the bathroom. I said, why not? She said, because we opened the door, they had a bar over there. She said, I'm not going in there to use the bathroom. They got alcohol in there. Okay? I said, Taylor, they're not. It's a restaurant. You eat there. They do have that, but you don't have to give it. So I don't care. I'm not going in there. So she was hard set against it. So again, what you were raised, what you're used to. I had a boy I went to school with. His mother was Italian. His dad married her when they were in the military. He was in the military, and great cook. But if you went to their house to eat, you should have great pasta meals, but she'd have wine. That's what they drank. That's what she was used to. So, again, what are you used to? All right, and how does that play with you? But for me, it was wrong. When I was doing it, I knew it was wrong. It was wrong. Okay. All right. Like I said, get off on a whole study of that. That's what Paul has to say about it here. All right, appeal for unity, 15, 7 through 21. Paul's request at the beginning of this section is to receive one another just as Christ also received us to the glory of God. It is understood as an appeal to the disputing factions in Rome, especially the Jews and Gentiles. He discussed all their issues of contentions and shown God's revealed will with regard to them. He proved conclusively that all are saved by faith in the gospel as a result of God's grace. Therefore, we are all equal in God's sight. No person has any grounds for boasting. And his thing was here, the whole conclusion of this was that unity. We're all Christians. Whatever background you came from, whether you raised Jew or a Gentile, whatever it was, now we're Christians, and we're all the same. Just because you were a Jew don't make you any better of a Christian than if you were not a Jew. Okay, and that was, and some of them had a big problem with that. Verse 12, in him the Gentiles shall hope. It is the God of hope who has called all to Christ. Paul, I think he makes an interesting statement here at the end. Paul was apostle of the Gentiles. That's kind of weird that he was apostle of the Gentiles when he was raised the strictest set of the Jews. He was a Pharisee. And, he was hard set against any Gentile. They were dogs. They were lower than dirt. He didn't have anything to do with them. But he was the one who ended up being the one sent to them. He formerly persecuted Christians with zeal, but now he was being persecuted because of that. So some people say that it's impossible to overcome the prejudice you were raised with. Paul doesn't think that. He didn't accept that argument. He said you could love all men of every race, so could others. If he could do it, you could. So Christians must come together in unity. Differences can be and must be overcome. God did it for us. We must do the same to please him. So whatever our background, we're all the same at the foot of the cross. You've heard that saying before. All right, we're doing pretty good on time. All right, let's questions or comments on that. Okay, I know we could have a lot of comments and a lot of questions on some of those things. All right, number 8. Part 8, closing remarks and greetings, Romans 15, verses 22 through 16:27. Says, at the end here, this letter turns a lot more practical information regarding his personal plan. So it's a letter. It's an epistle letter to these people, and he starts you see in this letter, who he had written it to, who was carrying the letter, all those kind of things, who the greetings were, all those. So it starts out here with fourth missionary journey. We know Paul made 3, and we don't know about a 4th one. All right. The first, him and Barnabas went to Cyprus and Galatia, and what's Turkey now? Read about that in chapters 13, 14. Second trip, him and Silas went primarily to Macedonia, parts of what is modern Greece. And then the first time, really, the gospel was preached on the continent of Europe, and we do know it spread from there. And then Paul's third journey took more than 2 years, and it was to Asia, the part of Rome and province that was Asia Minor, we call it now. And then the farewell speech to the letter of Ephesus, he stated he knew he'd never see him again, and he would not return to their region. Okay. In Romans 15, we learn why Paul did not expect to. The reason was he had hopes of going the other direction. He wanted to go to Spain. And we don't know if he ever made it there or not. We're not sure if he made it that far. But he was traveling back to Jerusalem to deliver gifts because the Christians there were in dire need. And they had took up a collection from these other places, from a lot of the Gentiles, and they were sending it back to Christians that were Jewish there back in them, and he was delivering that. It says these passages there, it reads that in Corinthians and Acts, refer to how much of Paul's time and energy was devoted to that, and his love both for Jews and the Gentile. But did he make that 4th journey? We don't know that. But the letter in Philippians, Paul seems confident being released. He'd been in prison a couple of times. Many of those scholars there believe that 1 Timothy and Titus were written during a period of freedom after his first Roman imprisonment, and the one Luke describes in Acts 28. So where are they written, what traveling do? We can't answer those, it says, but possibly did have a 4th missionary journey that made it all the way to Spain. All right? So he talks about here in 16 verses 1 through 27, greetings and final admonitions. So you remember how they got letters from place to place. There was no post office. The Roman government was very organized. It had a great system of roads and was very connected, which I feel like was God's timing and when the church was established. And the thing was terrible that the land of Judea and Israel was under Roman occupation at this time. But really, God used that to the advantage so that it was kept fairly peaceful. There weren't wars everywhere, and that there was great roads to travel, and it made it easier for the gospel to spread. So I feel like that timing was good. Maybe we see God's hand in a lot of things. Why was the restoration of the church, why did it take off here in the United States? Well, because we had religious freedom. Here was part of who we are, and it was the right environment for that to happen. So I feel like God makes these things happen at the right time, and this was one of them. But even with all that, they didn't have a government postal system. So if you had a letter you want to take somewhere, you had to give it to somebody that was going there that you trusted was going to deliver it. So that's how this was done. Each letter system must secure a method by which its reader could receive the message. Common method was to send letters by someone who was traveling to the destination intended for the letter. Here it was Phoebe, a Christian lady that Paul knew well. She was a traveler, and she wasn't the only one going to Rome this time, but she was the one entrusted with the letter, sounds like. It says Paul took advantage of the opportunity to recommend her to the church there and to praise her for service done by her to him. Little controversy here brings up about this. The phrase, a servant of the church, has caused confusion and difficulty in some. The word here that's translated as servant in English is from the form of the Greek word deakonos, which some will tell you this tells that she was a deacon and that it was okay to have female leadership in the church. That is definitely not what this is talking about. Okay, that is not how that was used in this. And the way you prove Scripture is what does it say in other places, and the Bible doesn't contradict itself. And it's very clear that women were not to take leadership roles in the church as a whole. Not elders, not deacons, not preachers. Okay, not song leaders. Okay, teachers, yes, but not up front kind of leadership. So that this is where some of that comes from when people misunderstand this. We see there in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 8 through 13, where we give the instructions of the qualifications, and those can only apply to a man. So that's pretty clear. They don't provide any ability there for female to fill that role. The normal translation it says of the word deaconess is servant. So she was a servant. We see that same word used there. We talk about establishing a church where it was apostles said it wasn't right for them to be serving tables. They had other work they needed to be doing, so they appointed men to take care of those things. Okay. All right. Romans 16, 3 through 16 contains the longest list of personal greetings of any of Paul's letters. One couple is mentioned to have been associated with it, Aquila and Priscilla, but otherwise those individuals are named only here in the New Testament. So he talks about several of those here that he was with, and I don't really see the good at this time for us to go each one of those and tell who they were and what they did, but there is a good list of those, kind of telling what they were. But the question then comes, well, if Paul had never been, how do you know all these people that were there? Well, Rome was a center, the capital of the Roman Empire. Like we said, a lot of travel took place in the Roman Empire, so it was pretty common for people to travel, especially to Rome. So it was a common destination, so there would have been people there that Paul would have known, even if he hadn't ever been there before. Okay. All right. Note and avoid. Let's look at chapter 16, verses 17 through 27. A good final point here to make. It says, the letter contains one more strong admonition. This one, again, against division. It says, now I urge you, brethren, note those who cause divisions and offenses, contrary to the doctrine which you have learned, and avoid them. Pretty strong. Okay. Note them means know who they are, make a check mark by them, be aware of them. Don't fall into their game there. Note those who are causing divisions, things that are contrary to the doctrine that we've taught you, to the teachings that we've taught you, and stay away from them. Okay. Previously, he had urged them to come together as brothers. At this point, he acknowledged the possibility that some would hold on to their prejudice and selfish desires. If so, they must be disciplined. By that, we mean church discipline, like withdrawal. Okay. They are not true Christians, serving their own belly rather than the Lord. In other words, their own desires, things that makes them happy, not what serves God. And they are to be excluded from the company of faithful believers. So these people who do that, then we should separate ourselves from them. Okay. So some of Paul's companions add their own greetings to this letter. Two of them identify the city of Corinth. So says Paul entered the epistle appropriately with a doxology of praise to God. God was praised for his care for the Roman Christians, for his revelation of the mystery of Jesus Christ, for the universal preaching of the gospel, and for his eternal and unmatched nature he has made glorious through Jesus forever. Going back to that a little bit about the divisions. I grew up out in the country, not even in town, but the nearest town was Brilliant, Alabama, which had a population of about 700 people. No red lights, okay, not even a caution light. You rode through. And they built the bypass around town, and you didn't have to go through town after that. So, very small community. But in that smaller community, the church down there is very similar to here. You can't drive 5 miles without passing a little congregation. But as small a town as Brilliant was, there was two congregations of the Church of Christ in that town. One on the north side of town, one in the middle of town. And I remember when I was in first grade, I had a boy in my class named Alan Holcomb. And we were talking about religion one day, even as first graders, and he said, where do you go to church? And I said, Church of Christ. And he said, you go to the right kind? And I was like, I didn't know there was but one kind. So what are you talking about? Okay. So the north side congregation had split years before over the issue of orphanage, whether you could support orphanages as a congregation. And it was something that could not been resolved, and a small group of people went over there and built their own building and worship separately there. And, that's some of those things where, I think it was not good to show division within the church when you could have worked that out among yourself, I think. So they had different times down through history they tried the members would meet and try to get back together, and they just never could work that out to come back together. And, I know one of the guys who was a member there, he drove a school bus for years there at the school system. Great man. And he practiced what he preached. He didn't believe in giving to orphanage, but he adopted several kids in his home. So if you're not going to support them, then how are you going to do it? Then you better be taking care of the widows and orphans. So he did that. So I think that was great. So we see issues of that even within the church where we have divisions where it doesn't look good to the outside to see us splitting over little issues that are not matters of getting to heaven. I don't think that's my opinion. Okay. All right. So the summation says the Epistle to the Romans remains one of the most profound and complete discussions we have concerning the gospel of Jesus Christ. Though Paul addressed a number of difficult and controversial doctrines and issues, the overall tone of the letter is very warm and positive. Throughout the book, God's grace and love are manifested. Number one, the gospel is universal without prejudice or biases toward anybody. All need it, all can receive it. Though man's sin is grievous and filled with evil, God loves him anyway. Human pride is completely unjustified and counterproductive. Man has nothing of which to boast. No work that we can do that can be done to remove sin or redeem him. Only God through Christ can do that. So there are essential Christian doctrines, it says, that are not addressed in the book of Romans. Except it doesn't say anything about the second coming, not much about eternal judgment, heaven or hell, no instructions concerning the organization or worship. But the ones that it does talk about, it talks about in great detail. So the Romans is a great book to study. We learn a lot from it. Not everything, but the things that it covers, it does a very good job of. So I have not been in this class. I've been across the hall over there in another class this quarter. But I know, having been in Brother Mike's classes before, that you can't be around him without learning something. Okay? He's a very, very knowledgeable, one of the most knowledgeable men I've ever been around in my years in church. He knows his stuff and does a great job presenting it to us. So, hate y'all had to miss out him in his final lesson on this, but hopefully I accomplished what he said for me to do, was go by the book and finish the chapter. So we did that. Any comments, questions, observations? We're a little early, but kind of where we are for the night. All right. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for being here tonight. And we'll carry on. Our summer series is getting ready to start, so on Wednesday night, and that will be a good thing, I think. We have several different speakers lined up for that to come in and talk about several different topics. So look forward to hearing those in the weeks to come. Thank you for your attention, and y'all have a good night.